Hello and welcome to today's Environment and Energy Leader webinar titled Decarbonization Decoded, Unleash the Power of Supplier Engagement. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team at E&E Leader, we welcome you to this webinar sponsored by Enel X. Just a reminder for attendees joining us, if you have questions for the presenters, please submit using the Q&A button. All questions submitted today will be forwarded to both presenters after the event is over. We do not have any poll questions during the presentation today, but I will be interacting with those who have joined us today. And we do have an opportunity for attendees to communicate with each other during the presentation. Let us know where you are joining from. Say hi. You can use the chat feature to do this. There will be a resource available for all attendees during today's event, which is a copy of the slide deck. This presentation today is more of a short presentation with the slide deck, and then we spend a good majority of the time discussing questions that have come in from the attendees, or I should say registrants already. So we do appreciate the active engagement from our registrant list even before we started today's event. So I'm just going to go over and introduce the presenters today, and then I'm going to give them the mic because obviously you are here to listen to Alvaro and Adrian, both from Enel. They both have a vast amount of experience in decarbonization and working with suppliers and working with companies to decarbonize their supply chain, really not just talking about scope 1 and 2, but scope 3 as well, since that is such a crucial part of the industry in today's world. So again, Alvaro Pereira, Head of Global Net Zero Advisory with Enel, and Adrian Dietz, Senior Sustainability Consultant. They're going to be talking to you, giving you some background on how you can decarbonize your supply chain. And then we're going to go into some questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Al, and I will rejoin both Al and Adrian for the Q&A section.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd like to provide some introductory comments on why we're doing this webinar and how important it is. I think the first one is that sustainability and decarbonization is really top of mind now, and companies are really striving to cut their carbon footprint and embrace clean energy. This is becoming more important because not only, from a voluntary perspective, companies are being asked by their investors, by their stakeholders, internal and external, to cut their carbon footprint, but also because it's starting to happen on the compliance front, with many governmental organizations requiring not only reporting of carbon, but also decarbonization plans going forward. But in order to do that, we really need a broader strategy. And that involves not only scope 1 and 2, the direct emissions, but also scope 3, which really involves the supply chain. And partnering with suppliers, the second point, is crucial to tackling GHG emissions across the entire value chain, because these scope 3 emissions really are quite large generally compared to the scope 1 and 2, known as direct emissions by companies. The other important point is some of those scope 3 categories, there are 15 categories specified by the GHG protocol, are more difficult to measure than others. So if the scope 3 emissions data are not calculated accurately, it could result in financial loss and damage to your business. So it's important to not only measure what you have now, but also plan reductions going forward and actually implement, which we'll get into. And then finally, collaborating with suppliers and partners, you can achieve these ambitious emissions reductions. There's just no way really to tackle scope 3 emissions without intense collaboration with suppliers and partners, and also, as we'll discuss, customers potentially, depending on what sector you're in and what type of industry you work with. Next slide, please. So who is Enel? Enel obviously is a large energy company, but we're going to talk here specifically about our role as an advisor in terms of energy advisory and sustainability advisory. And I think obviously those two are interconnected. The way to address climate change generally is to decarbonize your energy sources. So we provide that holistic approach that really combines both energy advisory and sustainability advisory. We offer a range of advisory services, not only including energy supply, risk management, but also the emissions of reporting and also decarbonization workshops. And as I mentioned before, we strive to implement some of those solutions as enhanced by some of our digital applications. We have an extensive experience in energy advisory. We support many Fortune 100 companies, and we have the expertise to help navigate, the complexities of supplier engagement. So if you look at the wheel on the right, and Adrian's going to talk about the wheel in detail in terms of supply chain engagement, but it all starts with measurement, right? We have to understand our current state in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, this focus of today's webinar is on scope 3, and we do that looking at either the GHG protocol or the ISO standards. But once you understand your existing emissions, we want to be able to plan how to decarbonize that. What is your strategy? How do you manage that? And there are a number of offerings that you can use there. You can, for example, have a roadmap that's focused on scope 3. You can look at specific strategies around sustainability. And once you plan and you have an understanding of what to do in terms of the actions, you can actually implement those. So different implementations can happen directly, for example. We know some of them, for example, energy efficiency, on-site solar. But here specifically, we're talking about actions that can be implemented across the value chain. So cooperation with your suppliers and cooperation with your customers. And finally, you want to be able to report your progress, right? So once we measure, we plan, we implement, we want to be able to report how that's impacting the initial levels that we measured on an annual basis. So it's important to report progress. As I mentioned before, we'll dig into some of these a little later with respect to supplier engagement specifically. Next slide, please. So why supplier engagement is crucial? We're going to, first of all, describe the journey throughout the supply chain, discuss the different participants and what we mean by a supply chain. Then we'll talk through the 5 types of supplier engagement and how to achieve your climate targets. As I mentioned, this is sort of a variant of that wheel I just discussed. And we'll show a customer case study and how we enabled that for a customer. Finally, we'll provide some insight into how we can support and how you can get started on your supplier engagement journey. Next slide. Yeah, we'll start with the decarbonization journey. Thanks. So in terms of reducing scope 3, it's important when we look at this that we look at it across the entire supply chain, and it demands collaboration from all the supplier tiers. You can see on the right where you have the processing by the customer. So let's assume that's the reporting entity that we're working with. That reporting entity needs to report on all its emissions. We already talked about the scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, but also the important scope 3 emissions that involve emissions outside of that entity. So in this graph here, we basically show the upstream emissions. So emissions that come before the processing that's done. And that includes not only emissions from their tier 1 suppliers, but also emissions from the suppliers of the tier 1 suppliers. And those suppliers can include raw materials, they can include transportation, they can include extraction of materials. The other thing that's important to remember is the processing of the customer, the reporting customer itself, can have suppliers themselves that are raw material suppliers. So what's interesting about when you look at a value chain, it's not simply a linear representation of how products get moved to the processing plant. It's almost a matrix, right? Because you have the processing plant not only purchasing from a supplier, but can also be purchasing directly from the supplier's suppliers. And I know this can get quite confusing, but it does point to the importance of collaboration. So when you look at how do you prioritize the reduction of these upstream, it's really generated through the life cycle of the goods and services a company purchases. So as I mentioned, in terms of the relationships between the processing company or the customer that we're really focusing on and its suppliers, there are other interactions that need to be considered from the beginning of the extraction of when those raw materials are basically procured, all the way to delivery and processing by the company. The other thing that we don't mention here, we don't in the slide in this graphic, is the downstream. So after the goods get processed or manufacturing by the reporting customer, they obviously get shipped further along. They can be shipped to direct use by final consumers, or they can be shipped to other customers that have further processing. What's interesting is the strategies that we describe here in terms of supply chain engagement can also be used for downstream partners as well. Now, the importance of those downstream emissions will differ based on the industry. For some industries, downstream is actually more important than upstream. For other industries, upstream is critical. For example, if there's a manufacturing company that involves a lot of inputs, a lot of purchases of goods and services that get manufactured or processed, but then those products then get sold on to somebody else where there isn't a lot of additional emissions, then maybe it's okay to focus on just the upstream. But there are some customers, for example, that still purchase a lot of goods and services to manufacture their products, and the products that they sell to customers use a lot of electricity, for example. So those downstream emissions also should be considered and are critical to be decarbonized as well. So even though we focus here on upstream and really understanding the emissions from suppliers, tier 1 suppliers, and prior to that, it's important to understand that this also applies to downstream partners as well. So finally, overall, I think encouraging both suppliers and customers to tackle emissions is the only way to significantly reduce the overall carbon footprint. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to turn it over to Adrian to discuss in detail more the 5 types of supplier engagement to achieve your climate targets.
Here we go. Sorry. Thank you very much, Al. So let's now explore the 5 different approaches of supply engagement that are critical in achieving climate targets. An understanding of these categories will help you to customize your approach to effectively reduce emissions throughout your supply chain. Each of these types offers unique strategies and benefits that ensure comprehensive climate actions. So here you see the 5 different approaches. And the key message is that there are these 5 approaches combined are a holistic approach in order to decarbonize your supply chain. So first, there's the maturity supplier engagement. Then second, an emission inventory engagement. Third, a climate target engagement. And fourth, renewable energy adoption engagement. And last but not least, the primary data engagement. So the maturity supply engagement is essential and hence mandatory to do it first to understand the status quo of the supply chain in terms of climate action. While the other 4 approaches can be chosen depending on the customer's objectives or the supplier's maturity level. Altogether, these engagement approaches help suppliers to build a robust climate management system and subsequently implement decarbonization measures. But most importantly, these approaches lead to a reduction in Scope 3 emissions on the customer side so that they can achieve their climate targets. On the next slide, I will go more into detail about these approaches. Next slide, please. So first, on the left-hand side, the general and maturity engagement approach. The aim of this approach is to prepare suppliers for the program and to get the buy-in of the supplier's management and to understand the status quo of the supplier's climate measures. This is achieved through information events and direct exchanges and data requests with suppliers. The next is the emission inventory engagement. The aim of this is to enable suppliers to fully calculate and report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This will be achieved through an educational platform provided by Enel, which includes everything about climate management and climate-related issues. In addition, we offer interactive online trainings to create a better understanding of climate management and to better respond to the questions of the suppliers. In order to track the suppliers' emissions, we also provide a reporting dashboard. Finally, once the suppliers have a full emission inventory, this is essential to correct or to best set climate targets with regard to science-based target setting. And this leads me to the next of the 5 approaches, which is the climate target engagement. The aim of this climate target engagement is to enable suppliers to set science-based near-term targets by 2030, or ideally to set long-term targets by 2050 at the latest. Also, the educational platform plays a major role here. It presents everything which is to do with climate target setting and how these targets can be achieved through decarbonization measures. The progress made towards the target achievement is also shown in the reporting dashboard, which is provided from us. Setting climate targets is one of the most important steps on the path to decarbonization. Once suppliers have committed to climate targets, they will also begin to implement emission mitigation measures. And this brings me to the next point, which is the renewable energy engagement. The objectives of this engagement type is to empower suppliers to achieve their climate targets by developing a robust climate roadmap through the adoption of renewable energy in their operations. During this engagement type, we educate suppliers on possible mitigation measures to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and how to link a decarbonization roadmap to the overall climate strategy. We also educate in detail about different renewable energy products and how they can be implemented to phase out fossil fuels. We also offer additional services to the suppliers, supporting them in the selection of suitable renewable energy products and finding project developers that meet the suppliers' individual needs. However, in order to make the suppliers' decarbonization measures transparent and correctly visible, in the scope 3 calculation, the rate databases is required. And this is the last of the engagement approaches, which is the primary data engagement. Here the aim is to enable the suppliers to calculate product carbon footprints and share them with the customers in the form of product-specific emission factors. Here the suppliers are educated on the purpose of the PCF calculation and how PCFs are calculated and how they are shared with the customers. Here also we provide a solution to collect the primary data and make it available to the customers. This ensures that the supplier's emission reduction measures are also reflected and correctly accounted in the customer's scope 3 calculation. Finally, I want to mention that at any stage in this process, suppliers are free to hire external consultant advice at any time to support them with different needs outside the program to achieve the different targets set during the program. Next slide, please. So here we have a customer case study from a prominent Italian manufacturer for automotive braking systems. The overall objectives of the project was to improve the quality of scope 3 purchase product and service emissions by collecting primary data from the suppliers. So how it was done, we engaged the suppliers in requesting data and help them understanding the importance of primary data for emission calculations for the customers. The result was that the quality the data quality from the customers improved, and they were able to identify emission hotspots more accurately, and subsequently could develop reduction measures within the supply chain. Likewise, the suppliers within our customer supply chain are also more aware of climate issues and decarbonization measures, which leads to an improved decarbonization performance.
Well, Adrian and Al, thank you so much for the presentation. We do have some questions that we are going to get into at this time. And Adrian, I think I'm going to start with you. What are some of the biggest obstacles that I will face integrating suppliers into my decarbonization strategy?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say the biggest issue is really to bring them on board and make them participate in the engagement program itself. This means the largest obstacle is to get feedback. So what we say is always to be proactive, even if you don't get a response, be proactive, ask again, and really request if they need anything more for decision making, if maybe other people need to be involved to make the decision for the engagement. This is what I would say is one of the largest obstacles.
Al, did you have anything you wanted to add to that from your experience?
Yeah, I think what we run across is what we call supplier fatigue a lot, because suppliers, as you can imagine, get a lot of requests, right? So the last thing they want to do is have another survey. So I think it's really important for us to balance be judicious in what we ask them, but also try to do as much work outside of the individual questionnaire. For example, let's say we send them a survey. Is there a way we can collect the data we need from publicly available sources, for example, just to try to reduce the amount of work that it would take to be involved? Because as you can imagine, the suppliers can be working for a number of customers. If each of these customers had its own supplier engagement process, and it can be quite daunting for suppliers. So I think that to me is an important obstacle that we can help manage, is how do we manage that supplier fatigue so we can maximize their participation.
No, really, really good point there. And just to kind of follow up on what you guys have both said, what are some of the basic questions that you get from suppliers when you start the process? Adrian, did you want to take that one?
Yes, thank you very much. So basic questions are, for example, what resources do they need to allocate to the program, to the project? What is the process itself? What does it mean? What are the outcomes? So very basic questions, in fact, and also the help they get from our side, from the customer side, and what the additional help is they can get from us, from Enel, or also from external consultants if they cannot meet the requirements or the requests from their customers.
No, definitely makes sense. Al, before I go on to the next question, did you want to add from your experience of working with suppliers and customers, what they're asking for up front?
Yeah, it's just, I think a lot of suppliers are just worried that they may not be able to meet the requirements or the questions. And I think it's more just being available to answer questions, supporting them during the process, right? I think that's really critical. And like I said, if we can manage the requests from customers, that will help them feel more comfortable. But I think, Adrian's response was spot on in terms of the requirements.
No, yeah. And I think as you both said too, maintaining that open communication, just making yourself available, because
Yep.
I'm sure suppliers come up with questions throughout the process that maybe they didn't think of, when
That's right.
when they started the process. So,
Yep.
just having that open dialogue will definitely help throughout the process. Al, I'm going to stay with you. Would the same considerations and approach apply to engaging downstream supply chain participants, customers, distributors, and users? And you
Yeah.
touched a little bit on this already, but anything else to add?
Yeah, a lot of the basic components that Adrian talked about, right? The inventory, understanding your emissions, understanding the actions that you can take, implementing those actions, those are all the same, right? The key difference is that when you're talking with your supplier, it's something that they are they are the customer to you, right? So in terms of influence, you might have a little more influence because you are actually responsible for providing revenue to those suppliers, right? On the other hand, when you're talking to your customers, those are the entities that are providing you revenues. So you want to get them involved, and you want to make them, you want to relay the message that everybody benefits from this, right? So if the customer decarbonizes, they improve their own footprint, as well as, which is the same thing for the supplier side, but you have to do it in a different way, in the sense that you have to, I wouldn't say be a little more cooperative, but yeah, approach it differently because it's more of a downstream. And I also think you're dealing with different types of industries. For example, distributors and warehousing is different than, for example, upstream which tend to be manufacturers and more, raw material extraction, things like that. So there's a little different approaches there, but I do think those components of the engagement wheel are really, really similar, and it can be adapted relatively easily.
No, that makes sense. And just a reminder for all attendees, you are going to get a copy of the slides that were shared earlier in the presentation, so you can go back and refer to anything that Adrian and Al referenced during the Q&A, and just to have that as a resource. Adrian, I'm going to go to the next question with you, unless you have something else that you'd like to say to follow up on what Al just said.
Thank you. I think Al covered everything. So the good thing with the wheel is it can be applied downstream and upstream as well, because the approaches really took a lot of time in thinking about how it can fit best the customer needs, and we saw customers really facing issues downstream and did not know how to tackle it, and we came up with this idea, and they were like fascinating, that it's possible, that there are ways to decarbonize downstream. So yeah, just to add on this. Thank you.
No, yeah, great. And so I'm a supplier. So how do I get started with a supplier engagement strategy? Is that going to look different depending on the size of my organization? Just some questions around there. Adrian, if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yeah, I would say just start, make the first step, and do not hesitate. That is really the first thing. When I talk with customers, they have issues, are afraid, on this huge journey, I would say. So really start, identify your emission hotspots within your supply chain, and then it's not 10,000 suppliers. Then it's probably 50 or 100 or maybe 200, but it's a lower amount, and you can start and focus with them. And once you have done, contact them, assess the maturity, and then you know in which part of the wheel you can start, because when you start the journey, you will recognize the suppliers are in different stages of maturity. One maybe has already emission inventory calculated, others have not. Same for climate strategy, same for renewable energy adoption. And once you start it and you get the bigger picture, and then you can set all the puzzles together, and then you have your approaches, can set objectives, targets, and then you just can start.
No, makes complete sense. And just start. I feel like a lot of people that join our webinars, or even it's something that our clients talk about too when we have these webinars, is people don't think that they're ready to start the journey. But if you're no one's ever really truly 100% ready. But if you just take that step and work a little bit at a time, starting is better than not starting. So Al, do you have anything you want to add to what Adrian said?
And it's not just starting, it's continuing, right? So we've worked with customers that have started a supplier engagement and it's stalled, right? They've been overwhelmed with the number of suppliers, or they haven't had success getting information from suppliers. So I think there are ways around that. As Adrian mentioned, you can identify hotspots. You can focus on the top suppliers. You can even use proxies, right? So even if you know that your suppliers are in a certain industry and you can't get information from one supplier, maybe there are similar companies that already have that information publicly available, right? So there are ways to fill these gaps. So I think it's important to not get sort of overwhelmed by the data, because it is really easy to get overwhelmed by the numbers potentially of suppliers. But I think there are ways around that you can get a good sense of how to proceed and just keep going, because I think we all, what's important is that as we all work through this journey, meaning all suppliers, all companies, we all benefit, right? Because as I mentioned in that discussion about the matrix and the upstream, a lot of these industries are interconnected. So companies will have the same suppliers and similar suppliers. So the more we can improve the data quality and decarbonization for everyone, the more all of us benefit. You're on mute, Jessica.
You know, it was bound to happen. I was gonna say, usually it's me during these events that, is on mute while I'm talking. So no, I think it's really important, a really important point that you mentioned, because you're not always, what do you do if you can't get data from a supplier and you really, you need that data? You can use, as you said, a proxy, you can use, industry standards, what other information is public. And so what kind of conversations have you helped your suppliers engage with, like their suppliers, their value chain with, in terms of collecting that data? If the companies that they're working with, the suppliers they're working with, aren't providing, the exact data that they would need. Al, did you want to take that?
Yeah, I think when we talk to customers, we always ask, for example, who are your peers? Who is in your industry? So it's not only to understand their processes and their industry needs, but understand who else can we look to, because each industry has leaders, right? Then you can look at, for example, a certain company that does it one way, and which has lessons that you can apply to a supplier or to a certain sector. So I think that's what we show. And that also happens on the downstream side, where customers don't realize how much that of decarbonization and emissions work that their customers have done. They also don't realize how much their suppliers have done until we sort of specify. It's like, look, this is publicly what we've seen that they've announced that they have available. So I think those are the kinds of ways that we can, demystify the whole process and help suppliers get involved.
No, I like how you say that, demystify the whole process there.
Yeah.
Adrian, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I hope you don't mind that. What do you see for the future when it comes to data collection within, your specific industry and working with suppliers? So thinking future, the next year, 5 years, 10 years.
With regard to data collection, what we recognize is that currently there is data is available, but you need to dig into it. You need to search for it. You have different reporting platforms, so it's not consolidated somewhere, and it's not. Sometimes it's easy accessible, sometimes it's not easy accessible. So what I see and what I think where the journey goes to are two different things. One is that there will be a database, easy accessible database where you can have data insights within the supply chain. And on the other hand is that customers need to process these data for their own calculations and reporting, right? And that there will be also better solutions in the future to make this calculations easier and the reporting more transparent for their stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point, and stakeholders also being consumers too. I think in today's world and going into the future, consumers, are more aware of direct results from supply chains and want to make sure that the products that they're supporting, the companies that they're supporting, are truly invested and an ethical supply chain, and want to see that data, want to know that not necessarily the specific numbers, but know that the companies that they support are working towards their decarbonization goals, their different sustainability goals. So I think that's a really important part. And Alvaro, how have you seen the industry change over the past, 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years? Obviously, COVID impacted, we don't need to go into all the supply chain issues that
Yeah.
were a result of COVID, but, what have been the biggest, changes within the industry besides just transparency? Because I think that's something that a lot of companies, in the past, they didn't want to disclose the numbers because they didn't want to show, oh, we weren't making the progress that we thought. But from from different stakeholders, any type of progress is good. And just, even showcasing a small amount of progress is better than completely shutting all stakeholders out to data.
Yeah, I think the progress, especially around scope 3, I mean, we talked about supplier engagement, but just measuring your supply chain emissions has been unbelievable, right? I mean, I think 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, the focus was always on scope 1 and 2, the direct emissions from purchased electricity, purchased natural gas, which are important, clearly. But I think now there's almost universal agreement that if you don't tackle scope 3, it's not, you're not really doing a lot, which is quite a change. I mean, I know, for example, companies in Europe may have been ahead of a little bit than the US companies, for example, but even US companies now, every conversation has some scope 3 component. Of course, the next question is, what do we do about it? And I think this is what this webinar is about, right? It's you understand that you have to do this, which is the change. Now the question is, what do we do about it? And hopefully we provided some guidance, there.
Oh, no, I think you definitely did. Before we wrap up the presentation, again, reminder that this event is available to watch on demand. So if you missed part of the opening, feel free to go back and watch it again. And you can download a copy of the resources and also get in touch with our speakers. Their information is at the very end of the presentation in your resources section too. So takeaways. I'm going to ask each of you to give 3 takeaways that you want our attendees to leave with. So Adrian, and again, I'm putting you on the spot right away. So give three main takeaways for our attendees today.
Okay, thank you. I think the first main takeaway is that decarbonizing the supply chain is possible, and you just need to start. And that for this, we have this comprehensive 5-step approach, which is a holistic strategy. And really the focus of this is really to decarbonize, to take action, and not only just to engage and let the suppliers alone, but to be collaborative. And this is the third takeaway. Supply chain decarbonization is a collaborative effort. So you cannot do it alone. You need to do it together. And with together, I mean, as Al said at the beginning, it's not customer to tier one. It's really down the whole supply chain. And only then we will see results, and we can achieve climate targets as a collective. Thank you.
Yeah, well said. All right, Al, I'm going to give it to you, and then I'll wrap up today's event.
Yeah, that was like 10 takeaways, Adrian, but
sorry.
But you know what? Every time I ask for like 3, it always ends up being more than that. I used to ask for 5 and then realize that 5 would turn into like 15.
No, it's fine. I'm just joking. I think, obviously the first one is that supplier engagement or value chain engagement is critical to reducing, your carbon. I mean, it's just, you cannot really have big impacts on your carbon footprint without that. That's the first takeaway. The second takeaway I just want to reinforce is get started or keep going. There are ways to show progress that are not as difficult as you may think. So we mentioned some of the techniques we can use to address some of the gaps. So that's the second takeaway. The third takeaway is when you implement these actions, we didn't really focus on implementing actions jointly with the supply chain. There are ways forward where, for example, you can tackle your supplier's scope 2 and thereby tackling your scope 3. And as we mentioned, that these kinds of actions benefit not only you as the company, but also your suppliers. So I think that kind of collaborative implementation and getting that message that you both benefit is really important. So that's about 3.5 takeaways, but those would be my 3. So.
No, I think it's good. Yeah, you obviously want to showcase, what this collaborative effort is going to do to benefit both, and how, working together is just going to be better, not just for your company, but for the other companies and the rest of the suppliers too, down the
Exactly.
value chain. So
Yep.
Alan, Adrian, and the team at Enel, I want to thank you for a great presentation today. There will be a quick survey that pops up on your screen for all attendees after the event. And if you could fill out the survey, that would be great. Any data that we can collect and feedback helps us prepare for future webinars, also provides good feedback for our speakers. So again, thank you for being on with us today. And at this point, I'm going to conclude the webinar, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks again.